Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. Imagine a world where one bullet never found its mark. A world where a single man's survival could have rewritten history. On June 28, 1914, a series of seemingly random events led to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria. His death triggered a chain reaction that plunged the world into the First World War. But what if things had played out differently? Could one missed shot have changed the entire course of the 20th century? To understand the gravity of that moment, we need to step back and look at the tense political landscape of Europe in 1914. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was a fragile, multi-ethnic state struggling to hold itself together amid rising nationalist movements. The Balkans, often called the powder keg of Europe, were rife with unrest. Serbia, in particular, sought independence for Slavic nations under Austro-Hungarian rule, leading to tensions that were ready to explode at the slightest provocation. Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, traveled to Sarajevo with his wife Sophie on June 28th for an official visit. That morning, a group of young Bosnian Serb nationalists, backed by the secret society known as the Black Hand, set out to assassinate him. The first attempt failed. A grenade thrown at the Archduke's car bounced off, injuring several of his entourage instead. It seemed as if fate had intervened to spare him. But in a twist of tragic irony, later that day, a wrong turn by his driver placed him directly in front of one of the would-be assassins, Gavrilo Princip. At point-blank range, Princip fired 2 shots, killing both Franz Ferdinand and his wife. At first glance, this was just another political assassination in a time of instability. But why did this one act lead to a war that engulfed the world? The answer lies in the intricate web of alliances that had formed between Europe's great powers. Austria-Hungary blamed Serbia for the assassination and declared war. Russia, an ally of Serbia, mobilized against Austria-Hungary. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, declared war on Russia. France, bound by its alliance with Russia, entered the fray. When Germany invaded Belgium to get to France, Britain joined the fight. Within weeks, Europe was at war. It wasn't just about one man's death, it was about what he represented. Franz Ferdinand's assassination was the spark that ignited the dry tinder of a continent already primed for war. But if Princip had missed, would war still have been inevitable? Or did history hinge on those 2 fatal bullets? Now let's step into an alternate reality, a world where Gavrilo Princip never fired those fatal shots, or perhaps his bullets missed. Maybe the Archduke's security detail was better prepared, rerouting his car away from danger. If Franz Ferdinand had escaped Sarajevo alive, how would history have changed? At first, the world might have breathed a sigh of relief. Austria-Hungary would still be furious with Serbia. The failed assassination attempt would confirm their worst fears. Serbian-backed nationalist movements were a direct threat to the stability of the empire. However, without the assassination as an immediate justification, Austria-Hungary would lack a clear and urgent reason to launch a military response. But tensions wouldn't simply disappear. The political landscape of Europe in 1914 was already a tinderbox, and Austria-Hungary had been searching for an opportunity to reassert control in the Balkans. Even without Franz Ferdinand's death, the empire's leaders, particularly Emperor Franz Joseph and the hawkish military command, might have still pushed for action against Serbia. The key question is whether they could have convinced the rest of Europe that a war was justified. Germany, under Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been preparing for conflict, seeing war as inevitable and even desirable to assert its dominance in Europe. The German leadership had already assured Austria-Hungary of its full support, known as the blank check, meaning they were willing to back Austria in a conflict against Serbia and its allies. However, without the emotional and political shock of the Archduke's assassination, Germany might have faced more resistance in rallying Austria-Hungary toward war. Diplomatically, this surviving scenario would have created an extended period of tense negotiations. Austria-Hungary might have tried to pressure Serbia through diplomatic means, demanding greater control over its internal affairs, or even a military occupation under the pretext of preventing future terrorist plots. Serbia, backed by Russia, would have resisted, but neither side would have the same immediate urgency to escalate to full-scale war. The big unknown is whether Austria-Hungary would have eventually found another excuse to invade Serbia. Nationalist movements in the Balkans were growing stronger, and Austria-Hungary saw them as an existential threat to its empire. If war had been delayed rather than prevented, Austria might have waited for another provocation, perhaps a border clash or another attempted attack on a high-profile official, to justify military action. At the same time, Germany's ambitions might have still driven events toward war. The German leadership believed that a European conflict was only a matter of time, and they feared that delaying war would allow their rivals, particularly Russia and France, to grow stronger. If tensions in the Balkans remained high but didn't immediately lead to war, Germany might have sought another reason to ignite the conflict on its own terms. This surviving scenario creates a complex alternate timeline. Without the assassination, World War I might not have begun in July 1914, but the underlying tensions in Europe would have remained. The question is, would war have simply been delayed, or could diplomacy have steered Europe down a different path entirely? If Franz Ferdinand had survived, the world would have faced a critical question. Would World War I still have happened? The answer isn't simple. The tensions that led to the war were much deeper than just one assassination, but without that single spark in Sarajevo, the timeline, and perhaps even the outcome, could have been very different. A delayed war. By 1914, Europe was already on edge. The great powers, Germany, Britain, and Russia, were caught in an intense competition, both militarily and economically. The arms race was in full swing, with Germany rapidly expanding its navy to challenge Britain's naval dominance, while Russia was modernizing its army to strengthen its influence in Eastern Europe. France, still bitter over its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870-71, was determined to recover its lost territories of Alsace and Lorraine from Germany. Every major power was preparing for the possibility of war, and the alliances they had formed, the Triple Entente, Britain, France, and Russia, and the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy, meant that any regional conflict had the potential to escalate into a continent-wide disaster. Even if the assassination of Franz Ferdinand had never occurred, Austria-Hungary still faced a major problem: how to maintain control over its increasingly restless empire. Nationalist movements, particularly in the Balkans, were growing stronger, and Serbia remained a threat to Austrian rule over its Slavic territories. Without the immediate excuse of the Archduke's assassination, Austria-Hungary might have waited for another incident, perhaps another nationalist uprising, a border skirmish, or a failed assassination attempt, to justify military action against Serbia. If Austria eventually invaded Serbia, Russia would likely have still intervened to protect its Slavic ally, triggering the same domino effect that led to war in our timeline. An avoided war? However, the survival of Franz Ferdinand could have introduced a major obstacle to war: himself. Unlike the military hardliners in Vienna, Franz Ferdinand was a moderate. He strongly opposed war with Serbia, believing that the empire's real challenge was internal stability, not external conquest. He was an advocate for reform, proposing a restructuring of the Austro-Hungarian Empire into a more federal system that would give more autonomy to Slavic groups. Had he lived, he might have pushed for a diplomatic resolution to Austria's problems with Serbia rather than military confrontation. This raises a key question: could his influence have prevented Austria-Hungary from pursuing war altogether? It's possible that, under his leadership, Austria would have pursued a more diplomatic course, perhaps increased political pressure on Serbia rather than military action. However, Franz Ferdinand was not yet emperor. He was only the heir to the throne. The real decision-making power lay with Emperor Franz Joseph and his circle of advisors, many of whom saw war as the only solution to Austria's growing instability. If Franz Ferdinand had survived but had been politically sidelined, his peace-oriented approach might not have changed much in the long run. Yet even if Austria-Hungary had chosen diplomacy over war, the Balkans would have remained a dangerous flashpoint. The nationalist movements in Serbia and Bosnia were not going away, and tensions between Austria and Serbia would have continued to escalate. If another crisis had erupted, perhaps a violent crackdown on Serbian nationalists, or a Serbian-backed rebellion in Bosnia, the region could have still become the catalyst for a major war. The final verdict, though, would World War I still have happened? The most likely answer is yes, but perhaps not in 1914. The deep-rooted rivalries, military buildups, and rigid alliances made war almost inevitable. The assassination of Franz Ferdinand wasn't the sole cause of World War I, it was simply the spark that lit an already explosive situation. If that spark had been avoided, another one would have likely emerged in the years that followed. However, there is an alternate possibility. Without the immediate crisis of Sarajevo, diplomacy might have had more time to work. Tensions could have eased, alliances could have shifted, and a different path might have been taken. Perhaps a great war would still have occurred, but under different circumstances, or maybe, just maybe, history could have turned toward peace. If World War I never happened, the trajectory of history would change in ways that are almost unimaginable. The war reshaped Europe, collapsed empires, led to revolutions, and set the stage for World War II. Without it, the 20th century would have unfolded in a radically different way. Austria-Hungary's survival? By 1914, Austria-Hungary was already in decline. It was a sprawling, multi-ethnic empire struggling to hold together as nationalist movements within its borders gained strength. The war hastened its collapse, as the strain of prolonged fighting, economic hardship, and ethnic divisions tore it apart. But without World War I, would Austria-Hungary have found a way to survive? One possibility is that the empire, instead of collapsing violently, would have been forced to reform. Franz Ferdinand himself supported restructuring Austria-Hungary into a federal state, granting more autonomy to Slavic regions. Had he lived, he might have been able to push for these reforms, potentially stabilizing the empire for a longer period. However, opposition from conservative elites in Vienna made this a difficult path. Even without war, Austria-Hungary was under immense pressure, and it's possible that nationalist uprisings could have eventually led to its breakup in a less destructive way. If Austria-Hungary had survived, the political map of Europe would look very different. There would be no independent nations of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, or Yugoslavia, at least not in the immediate aftermath. The Balkans might have remained a zone of tension, but without the war to accelerate the collapse, the breakup of Austria-Hungary might have happened gradually rather than through violent revolution and foreign intervention. No Russian Revolution? World War I was a disaster for Russia. The country suffered massive casualties, food shortages, and economic collapse, leading to widespread unrest. By 1917, the situation was so dire that revolution became inevitable. First, the Tsar was overthrown in the February Revolution. Then, later that year, the Bolsheviks seized power in the October Revolution, leading to the creation of the Soviet Union. But without the war, the Russian Empire might have survived much longer. The Tsarist regime was already facing internal problems: poverty, worker strikes, and dissatisfaction with autocratic rule. But without the additional strain of war, these issues might not have reached the breaking point so quickly. Tsar Nicholas, too, could have remained in power, or at the very least, reforms might have been introduced to transition Russia into a constitutional monarchy. Without a communist revolution in Russia, the world would be a very different place. There would be no Soviet Union, no Cold War, and no ideological battle between communism and capitalism that shaped global politics for the rest of the century. This also means that key figures like Lenin and Stalin might have remained obscure revolutionaries rather than leaders of a world superpower. No Treaty of Versailles, no Hitler. One of the most devastating effects of World War I was the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty, signed in 1919, placed full blame for the war on Germany and imposed harsh economic penalties, crippling its economy and humiliating its people. The resentment caused by this treaty created the perfect environment for Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party to rise to power. If World War I had never happened, Germany would not have suffered the same economic collapse. There would be no humiliating defeat, no war reparations, and no hyperinflation of the 1920s. Without these conditions, Hitler's message of revenge and national revival might not have resonated with the German people. The Nazi Party may never have gained the support needed to take control of Germany. Instead, Germany might have continued its trajectory as a rising European power, competing economically rather than militarily. It's possible that tensions between Germany, France, and Britain would still exist, But without the deep wounds of Versailles, there might not have been the same drive toward militaristic expansion. No WE as we know it? If Hitler never rose to power, does that mean World War II wouldn't have happened? Not necessarily, but it would have been a very different conflict. Without Nazi Germany, the major source of aggression in the late 1930s disappears. There would be no invasion of Poland in 1939, no Holocaust, and no blitzkrieg sweeping through Europe. However, tensions between the major powers could still have led to war under different circumstances. One possibility is that, instead of a German-led war, another conflict could have emerged in Asia. Japan was already expanding its empire in the early 20th century, and its ambitions in China and the Pacific could have eventually drawn Western powers into a confrontation. A war between Japan and the United States might have happened even without a European conflict. Additionally, if Russia had remained under Tsarist or moderate rule, it's unclear how relations between Russia and Germany would have developed. Would they have become rivals or partners in shaping the balance of power in Europe? Without the Soviet Union, the ideological conflicts that shaped the Cold War might have been replaced by traditional great power rivalries. A radically different world. The effects of World War I were so far-reaching that removing it from history would alter nearly every major event of the 20th century. The survival of Austria-Hungary, the continuation of the Russian Empire, the absence of the Soviet Union, and the prevention of Hitler's rise would create a world that is almost unrecognizable. Perhaps, Europe would have remained dominated by monarchies rather than republics. Perhaps colonial empires would have lasted longer, since the war weakened Britain and France's hold over their territories. Perhaps technological advancements, many of which were driven by wartime innovation, would have developed more slowly. Ultimately, while it's impossible to predict every detail, one thing is certain. Without World War I, the world we live in today would look nothing like the one we know. If World War I had never happened, the long-term global impact would be staggering. The war reshaped the world in ways that continue to affect us today, from the rise of superpowers to the drawing of modern borders. Without it, history might have taken a drastically different path. Would the US still become a superpower? Before World War I, the United States was a rising industrial power, but it was not yet the global superpower it would become in the 20th century. The war changed that. While Europe was devastated by years of conflict, the US emerged largely unscathed and became the world's largest creditor nation. American industry and banking flourished as the country supplied weapons, food, and resources to the Allies. By the time the war ended, the US had surpassed Britain as the world's leading economic power. Without World War I, this transformation might never have happened, at least not as quickly. Europe would not have been as economically weakened, and Britain and France might have maintained their financial dominance. The US might still have grown into a major power over time, but without the war's economic boost and the subsequent collapse of European dominance, its rise to global supremacy might have been delayed or even prevented altogether. Additionally, America's global military influence expanded due to its involvement in both world wars. Without WWI, the US might have remained more isolationist, avoiding entanglement in global conflicts. This could mean a world where American military bases are not scattered across the globe, and where international politics are less centered around American leadership. No Cold War? One of the biggest long-term consequences of World War I was the Russian Revolution, which led to the creation of the Soviet Union. The ideological battle between communism and capitalism defined much of the 20th century, culminating in the Cold War, a geopolitical struggle that shaped global politics, military alliances, and technological advancements. If Russia had never gone communist, the Cold War as we know it would never have happened. There would be no NATO versus Warsaw Pact, no nuclear arms race, and no ideological struggle dividing the world. Instead of a bipolar world dominated by the US and the Soviet Union, global politics might have remained centered around traditional European rivalries. However, this doesn't mean tensions between great powers would have disappeared. A different kind of Cold War could have emerged, perhaps a long-term rivalry between the US, Britain, Germany, and a still powerful Russian Empire. Instead of an ideological struggle between capitalism and communism, global conflicts might have been driven by competing national interests and colonial ambitions. Different modern borders? World War I directly led to the redrawing of borders across Europe and the Middle East. Without the war, many of the political boundaries we recognize today would look very different. The Middle East, after the war, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and its territories were divided between Britain and France. The modern states of Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan were all created as a result of the war. Without WWI, the Ottoman Empire might have survived longer, perhaps gradually declining rather than collapsing outright. The artificial borders drawn by European powers, which have contributed to conflicts in the region, might never have existed. The Middle East might have remained under Ottoman rule, or it could have fractured into independent states along different ethnic and religious lines. Eastern Europe and the Balkans, the fall of Austria-Hungary and the Russian Empire led to the creation of several new nations, including Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Yugoslavia. Without WWI, these nations might never have formed, at least not in the way they did historically. Poland, for example, regained independence in 1918 after more than a century of being partitioned by Germany, Russia, and Austria. If there had been no war, Poland might have remained divided, or its independence might have come much later through different circumstances. Germany's borders after its defeat in WWI, Germany lost significant territory, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, and parts of Prussia to the newly reformed Poland. If World War I had never happened, Germany might have retained these lands, possibly making it a stronger and more unified power throughout the 20th century. No Israel? The Balfour Declaration of 1917, issued during WWI, laid the groundwork for the eventual creation of the State of Israel. If the Ottoman Empire had never collapsed and British rule over Palestine had never occurred, the events leading to Israel's establishment in 1948 might have taken a completely different course. The entire history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict might look very different. A radically different world order. The absence of World War I wouldn't just mean no trench warfare or different political alliances. It would mean an entirely different world order. The 20th century was shaped by the aftershocks of the war, from the rise and fall of empires to the emergence of the US and Soviet Union as superpowers. Without it, history might have unfolded in ways that are impossible to fully predict. Would another global conflict have eventually erupted? Possibly. The forces that led to WWI, imperial rivalries, nationalism, military buildups, would not have disappeared. But without the exact conditions created by the Great War, the world we live in today might be unrecognizable. Franz Ferdinand's survival would have rewritten world history in unimaginable ways. The assassination was the spark that ignited World War I, but the tensions that led to the conflict had been building for years. Without his death, the war might have been delayed or avoided entirely, but the consequences of that change would ripple across the 20th century and beyond. Summary of key changes. If Franz Ferdinand had lived, Austria-Hungary might have survived longer, possibly reforming instead of collapsing. Russia might never have fallen to communism, meaning no Soviet Union, no Cold War, and no ideological struggle between capitalism and communism. Germany wouldn't have been humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, meaning Hitler might never have risen to power, potentially preventing World War II, or at least drastically changing the way it unfolded. The United States might not have become a global superpower so quickly, and the Middle East, Eastern Europe, and the Balkans would have looked very different. Final thought, would peace last? The big question remains, would peace have lasted, or would another war have broken out anyway? The rivalries between European powers, the arms race, and colonial competition weren't going away just because Franz Ferdinand survived. Germany was still growing in power. Britain was still determined to maintain naval dominance, and Russia still had its own ambitions in the Balkans. Without a war in 1914, another conflict might have erupted later, possibly under different circumstances and with different alliances. Perhaps instead of a world war, a series of smaller conflicts would have gradually reshaped global politics. Or maybe a great power struggle would have emerged later in the 20th century, under different leadership and motivations. Would it have been less destructive? Or would it have been even worse? Call to action. What do you think? Would a world without World War I have been a better place? Or would the same tensions have led to war eventually? Would peace have lasted, or would a delayed conflict have been even more devastating? Let me know. Your thoughts in the comments below. Let's discuss how history could have been completely rewritten.